All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today to hear about the work Victor Harbour Council has been doing to look into changes happening along its coastline and how these changes may impact the community, the natural environment and built assets such as homes, roads and other infrastructure, and what the options might be for managing these changes into the future. My name is Nicole Halsey. I'm part of the consultant team. I'm from URPS and we're facilitating today's webinar. I'm coming to you today from Kaurna country. I acknowledge that the project area is on Ngarrindjeri land, and I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land of any of us that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our webinar today comprises a series of presentations, or a couple of presentations, that Mark Weston from the project team will talk about. This recording will be made available on Council's website as well through to the end of the consultation period, which is until 1st of October this year. Please note that this format is a webinar format, which means essentially you won't be able to see or hear yourself, but we can certainly take questions as needed throughout the webinar. So with me today, I have a number of people from the project team. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Lee Jeffrey, who's from the City of Victor Harbour. Lee is Council's Environmental Project Officer and has been heading up this Coastal Adaptation Project. I might just ask folks if you could pop your mic on mute because it's reverberating. Thanks, Lee. We also have Kathy Hayter, also from the City of Victor Harbour. Kathy is the Director of Environment and Infrastructure. And I believe there's a number of council staff online as well. And finally, we have Mark Weston, who's from Integrated Coasts. And Mark is the consultant who has been engaged by council to undertake the Coastal Adaptation Project. So why are we gathered here today, folks? Today is an opportunity to hear about the adaptation options that have been developed off the back of the Coastal Adaptation Study that has been undertaken by council. This comprises the second stage of the project. Stage one was all about understanding what has been happening along the Victor Harbour coast, what assets are located there, such as roads, pathways, buildings, and so on, and how changes in climate might impact these into the future as a result of sea level rise. The second stage, which is really what we wanted to talk about tonight or today, has involved preparing the Coastal Adaptation Strategy itself. And this strategy will help council, the community, and other stakeholders plan for the future. So this process is really important, as even though we're thinking about the changes that might happen in the long term as a result of climate change, such as sea level rise, we still need to plan for them now so that we can make appropriate decisions in the shorter term. So, for example, many of the decisions that we make today, such as the resurfacing of a road or pathway or building, may last for many years and will be impacted by sea level rise in the future, hence why we need to think about it now. So in terms of the format of today's webinar, it will involve two key parts. Firstly, an overview presentation will be provided about key coastal concepts and terms that will help with understanding the key findings of the study and the options proposed. And then we'll move on to a presentation that will summarise the coastal adaptation strategies proposed for each cell that have been the focus of the project. And those are Haybarrow, McCracken, Encounter Bay and Victor Harbour Central. So on that note, I might hand over to Mark Weston to set the scene with key coastal adaptation concepts. Thanks, Mark.
I'll just share my screen. Okay, thanks, Nicole, and good afternoon, everybody, and also hello to future viewers of this video as well. It's great to be able to now present the Coastal Adaptation Strategy, which, as Nicole mentioned, is stage 2 of this project. So we're right down here now in the community engagement section. I thought it was a good time also just to refresh our memories about who has been involved in the project. Of course, I've been the main contributor to the project. We've also had Professor Patrick Hest, who's the head of environmental sciences at Flinders University, involved in the project. He's known as a coastal geomorphologist, which is a name for somebody who understands how coasts are formed and how they change over time. He's certainly an expert in the area of sand movement. Professor Bob Borman has also been involved. He's retired now, but offers his service occasionally to projects such as this. He's a geologist and must be regarded as probably the foremost expert on this area of Victor Harbour, having worked most of his career in this region. Now the team for stage 2 has been slightly different, and I'll just note on the bottom of the list there, we've also involved for this part of the project, the Grin and Associates, who are engineers specialising in coastal work. So that provides the technical overview and technical input to the Coastal Adaptation Strategy. Now, as Nicole said, we are going to do just a little bit of a recap to talk about the outcomes of the Coastal Adaptation Study, because this forms a bit of the foundation for understanding where we've gone with this. And then we wanted to also talk about, just in a general sense, what are the coastal adaptation options available to us? And then we'll look at the each individual cell. And when we're talking about a coastal cell, just a reminder, we have 3 cells, coastal cells, and these cells were adopted from the state government's coastal conservation cells, and you can find them on nature maps. And that's why they're numbered from 10 to 12 in the direction they are, because the numbering starts at the Murray mouth. We've also divided these coasts into smaller cells, minor cells, so we're able to have a really fine-grained look at the coast and also come up with some fine-grained adaptation options. So we'll start on Haber McCracken, and we'll end up with Victor Harbour Central. And we're really doing it this way because it's the easiest cell to the hardest. And also, if there are any questions, I'll throw back to Nicole occasionally if there are any questions as we get to the end of each of the cell presentation. So moving into the Coastal Adaptation Study, a review of that. One of the main outcomes, and I'll spend a little bit of time here because I think it's important, as the Coastal Adaptation Study created a baseline upon which to monitor future changes. The best definition I've found of a baseline is in 2 aspects. The first aspect is a quantitative level or value, from which other data and observations of a comparable nature are referenced. And the second aspect is information accumulated concerning the state of the system, the key words here, process or activity. The best way is to illustrate. So here we have an aerial photograph of the Kent Reserve area. And you can see here I've plotted a shoreline position as at 2018. So this is the first part of the definition, because we can use this to assess what changes happen in the future. So it forms a quantitative position, if you like, of the coast. But we can also go back in time, and here you can see that the coast in 1949 was a long way inland at this point of time. And then we can assess as we go over time how the coast has moved. This is 79, now 89. And by the time we get to 2012, it's actually moved further forward than it is today. So the state of this system has been a long-term accretion, but maybe now going back into a recession mode. Now, I've used an example here because it's obviously quite a dramatic one, but generally across the coast, we'll find the coast is moving all the time. Sometimes it's very stable, but there's often movement accretion, which means the coast is building out, or erosion, which means it's going back. So this gives us a good understanding how the coast has been operating over the last 70 years. Secondly, we created flood mapping to identify plausible futures, and this is just an example from the boat ramp area around in Bluff. And so we've flood mapped storm surges for current risk, 2050 risk where we're adding sea level rise of 300 millimetres, and storm surge for 2100 1 metre. We've also modelled what we call routine high water events, which are events that occur every month or so. We've identified key coastal issues and vulnerabilities, and again, you could go through the cell reports to locate these, but we've located areas vulnerable to flooding or erosion, current and future impacts upon assets, community and ecosystems. We've also provided a risk assessment for each coastal cell or minor cell, and this is just an example, where we've looked at the possible impact upon public infrastructure, such as roads, private assets, such as houses. Social disruption has the two concepts of public safety and also community concern, drawing upon the council's risk framework. And we also have a look at ecosystem disruption as well. Finally, in this project, we brought all previous work into one place of reference. So we really worked hard in the coastal adaptation stage, look back on all previous work and previous flood and storm events and bring that into this piece of work. These are the project outputs. They're on the council website. You can, if you want to look through the study report, it's more about methodology, a bit more technical. The main one you're probably going to be interested in is the 3 cell reports, which you can find there, and you can find your location of interest. Just as a viewing hint, I would always recommend it's designed to be read in full screen mode, and then you can use your arrow keys to navigate. It's the best way to move around those reports. So, of course, as Nicole said, stage 1 forms the base upon which to produce the second part of this project, namely the Coastal Adaptation Strategy. So this is the model of our coastal adaptation in a nutshell. This is what we've done initially. This is stage 1. We've done the study, we've assessed risks and vulnerabilities, and we've established a baseline. Now we see the next, the right-hand side of this diagram is an ongoing matter that was going to happen over years, decades, possibly even centuries, if seas rise rejected, where we're continually going to be assessing risks and vulnerabilities, identifying actions and strategies, taking action, and based upon monitoring in comparison to our baseline. So really, this second stage really just fits into this little area here. What we're doing is identifying options and strategies and recommending some action. So we can move now into having a bit of a review of the coastal adaptation strategies. And I recommend Coastal Adapt is a really good resource if you're interested to know more about how the options available for coastal adaptation. So the adaptation options are about 5 in summary. The first one is the best one of all, is to avoid the impacts of coastal hazards by ensuring that assets and services are not placed in locations that could be impacted in the future. Now, of course, in the area of Victor Harbour, this is a very developed coast, so it's not so much we can avoid anymore because most of the coastline is being developed. However, I think it's a good practice whenever we consider to put anything in the coastal zone that we ensure that we're not placing assets or services in locations that might be impacted in the future. And number 2 is what we call hold the line, or we used to call it protection. And that's installing protection infrastructure that reduces the impact of coastal hazards. And you can think of probably many places around the coast that has protection structures such as rock or concrete block. And the photograph on the right is a levee that's actually surrounding the caravan park. And later times, we also consider environmental practices such as strengthening natural dunes and other natural places so that we can form protective barriers against the erosion that might occur in the future. Number 3 is accommodate, and this is accept some degree of hazard or implement limited intervention to manage the hazard. Now, this is most often thought about in the context of a place that may be vulnerable to flooding from the sea, and not so much a problem in the Victor Harbour region. But this might be about accepting the fact that it's not possible to protect or not viable. And so there's an accommodation of some seawater flow on occasions, and it might be, for example, putting houses up on stilts. An example from Victor Harbour may be, for example, where we can't stop overtopping. It may not be viable to always stop overtopping of the swells that come from the Southern Ocean. And so we accommodate, or we allow and accept some degree of hazard that may overtop, as it does in the Soldiers Memorial Gardens area on occasions. Number 4 is managed retreat. This is progressively move assets or services away from the area that could be impacted by coastal hazards now or in the future. Very difficult to achieve when we're talking about urban infrastructure, private assets, and it's not been achieved very well around Australia at any time. But we do have one area of coast tonight we are going to talk about potentially a managed retreat strategy. And finally, number 5 is to accept loss. In other words, to say, well, we accept that coastal hazards will cause negative impacts. And when this occurs, we won't replace those assets or services. There are two main approaches in relation to time when it comes to thinking about coastal adaptation. The first approach is to take an incremental approach, and that's a series of relatively small actions and adjustments aimed at continuing to meet existing goals and expectations of the community in the face of the impacts of climate change. There's probably a good point here to divert to talk about projections of sea level rise, because it does relate to our incremental approach. So in 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change developed 4 greenhouse gas scenarios. You can see them across the top here, from the very low to the very high. Now, Coastal Adapt has these plotted on this graph here, and so on the left-hand side you have metres of sea level rise, and on the right-hand side, the bottom axis, we have time. So the first thing we can see is there's a very large range of outcomes, depending on which scenario we look at. And the other item we see here is that if we consider it 2030, there's very little difference between the very low greenhouse gas scenario and the very high as far as projections. Even when we move to 2050, it's not dissimilar. There's only 4 centimetres that separate the very low to the very high. So one of the problems we do face from a decision-making point of view when we think about adaptation is the projected sea level rises do not accelerate until the second half of the century. So there's a great deal of uncertainty about the outcomes in the second half of the century. On a positive note, of course, this allows a little bit more time through here. It's a bit of a time buffer to consider and to monitor sea level rise so we can make more accurate projections in the future. And just if you're wondering what that green squiggly line is, that's actually satellite observations that are currently underway of sea level rise. So in this point, it's probably a good time to talk about no regrets coastal adaptation when we think about incremental change. And I really like what the Coastal Management Study said in 2013. I think it's still relevant to think about today. And the study noted that it's prudent to limit initial costs while utilising available time to gather additional site data, obtain better estimates of the likely climate impacts. It is not sound management practice to implement major infrastructure spending on protection structures that may not be required for 50 or 100 years into the future. This is what we mean by no regrets coastal adaptation. So, for example, if we said, well, we'll look at these protections at 2,100, 1 metre sea level rise, and we're going to spend $10 million protecting the Victor Harbour coast and put rock everywhere, and the seas don't rise as projected, then we're certainly going to have regrets about the money we spent and also about the interventions that we have put into the shores all around Victor Harbour. On the other hand, if we actually simply do nothing, and then we are like to have regrets as things start to fall into the sea or we start getting flooding. So the final point here is that it's the quote actually said it's also essential that the strategy to be implemented is identified now and the planning for that implementation is put into place. So this is probably one of the driving comments or thoughts that drove our adaptation strategy. Because we thought, if we're not going to think of a strategy that's concrete and we can implement it now, if we're not going to think of now, when are we going to do that? So we put a lot of emphasis into really trying to nut down and try and work out a really more of a concrete strategy to be employed around the coast. The second item here is sometimes an incremental approach is not likely to work, and so we need a transformative approach. So the risks created by climate change may be so significant that they're going to be addressed through more dramatic action. And sometimes this may be as a result of a really significant event, which hasn't occurred at Victor Harbour, but in places around the world, you may have a really significant event and the society in general says, well, we're just not going to do what we've done in the past. We're going to take a completely different approach. So that ends section 1 and 2. I'm not sure whether Nicole's got any comments or wishes me to proceed on.
Thanks, Mark. I might give you a breather so you can have a quick gulp of water. So just a reminder for people who are online, feel free to ask a question or pose a comment through the Q&A function. So at the bottom of your screen or on your toolbar, you'll see Q&A. Just type in a question at any time or a comment and we can come to those. So at the moment, we don't have any questions or comments, Mark. So we're happy to flow into the next section if that's okay with you.
No worries. All right, we'll move into Hayborough, McCracken Hayborough, which is situated between Hindmarsh River and the council border on the east, which is near Investigator Car Park. Now, the main key points out of this, the Coastal Adaptation Study, was this section of coast has been stable in the context of lower energy waves in this location. So while it does go through minor cycles of erosion and accretion, the long-term trend has been for accretion at least since the 1949. And Dr. Bob, who was a contributor in the first part of the project, said this is one of the most stable parts of the coast, of the entire coast. So when we think about, we have here legacy issues, or these are issues relating usually to human intervention. In other words, interventions occurred in the back shore or the beach, and then we have to deal with that over time. So in this particular location, there's really only one major one, and that's the train line that was installed in 1864, which does divide the shore in two. However, private assets, and really most of the council assets, are also set a long way from the shoreline and are unlikely to be, or they won't be impacted by any sea level rise, at least over this century. There are minor assets like pedestrian crossover points, there's an old retaining wall, and there's also some stormwater outlets, which council's looking at. I think there's 3, is looking at upgrading this one as we speak. So when we think again about stormwater outlets, these are the 2 at the bottom of Haywood Street. The issue here is that stormwater creates scouring of the beach and lowers the beach levels. In fact, you can even see that here in this digital elevation model. So we've flood mapped this. And so the problem here is, of course, is that when the stormwater does scour the beach, this also becomes a point that's vulnerable to actions of the sea. And these places will be one of the first hit when it comes to sea level rise. So they become quite vulnerable. The erosion outlook, Professor Hest estimated at only 10 to 20 metres in this location due to the low small wave climate. And so again, when we look at our risk assessment, you can see here that the main one is going to be public infrastructure as we move towards the end of the century. And the main problem here is that under normal circumstances, we had no train line and the seas rose, then this shoreline could retreat. But when we have a fixed point across the top, it's not possible for the shoreline to move backwards. And so the embankment becomes steeper and steeper and steeper until such time it perhaps could collapse. But as I said previously, this is not an issue in the near term. We're talking about over the next, well, definitely in the second half of this century. So our adaptation strategy is quite simple for McCracken Hayborough, and the key point here is that coastline presents as stable but undergoes normal cycles of accretion and erosion, and predominantly that's been accretion, which means it's been building out. However, seas rise projected, the coastline is predicted to go into recession. So our adaptation approach here, we're recommending an incremental approach, so we'll monitor and respond as required. We talked about the assets under threat, the train line, pedestrian access points will become more difficult to manage. So the strategy is to hold the line to 2050 and beyond using environmental options, i.e. maintain a vegetative dune. So these are the adaptation tasks, and I'm not going to go through these in great detail, I'll leave them on the screen, but actually I will go through number 1 because that is relevant for the whole coast, which is to develop a monitoring program. So as we know, when we're talking about the modelled adaptation, it is essential to understand how the coast is operating and when it may be operating outside of the normal parameters due to sea level rise. So what does a monitoring program look like? And this is just a bit of a snapshot to give you an idea. I do think in the context of a stable coast, the monitoring actions should be kept simple and cost effective. So for example, we could compare the position of the shoreline using aerial photography. just cast your mind back to the Kent Reserve example. We can do that for the whole coast when the council gets a new aerial photograph, which they do every 2 years. We can then evaluate how the shoreline is moving. We can use digital elevation models to compare an old digital elevation model with a new one, and we can see how much the beach and dunes are changing. If we have a severe storm, we can identify the impacts and track recovery over time. We haven't talked about the South Australian broad profile lines, but they've been, I think it's about 10 around the Victor Harbour coastline. And these are actually surveys of the beach and right out into the ocean, about 800 metres. Whenever South Australian Protection Board updates these, we can also analyse what's happening offshore. And finally, Victor Harbour has a fantastic resource because you have a tide gauge and close vicinity, and you are able to, we can use those gauges to identify sea level rise trends and storm activity, which we did for the first project. Dr. Phil Watson analysed that tide gauge for us for nothing, and that's in the first report, which was a great contribution. So this was basically the adaptation task. The rest relate to stormwater, and that would be the conclusion of the Kraken Hayborough. Do you want me to move straight on, Nicole?
Thanks, Mark. I might give you a breather for a sec. We've just had some new people join us online. So just a reminder, at any time, if you have a question or comment, please type it into the Q&A function and we can come to that as we have our breaks in between or at the end of the presentation. So, Mark, I think you're talking about Encounter Bay next. Is that right?
Correct.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll leave you with it.
No worries. All right, we'll move around to the other end of the main Victor Harbour coastline, and this Encounter Bay cell goes from the Bluff boat ramp around to Kent Reserve, and we've divided into Tabernacle Road. Now, the key point of Encounter Bay from the Coastal Adaptation Study side is that the current position of the shoreline of this bay has been created over hundreds, thousands of years by the swells that swing around the rocky outcrops and wash up on the beach. And by rocky outcrops, I mean the bluff and the islands. However, the combination with increasing exposure, and by that I mean the Franklin Parade was installed in the backshore in the mid-1800s. So over 150 years, we've had increasing sea levels, probably around 200 to 250 millimetres. So this is increasing exposure, increasing the impact on the back of this backshore. And also the human intervention has occurred, has also brought about the need for increasing protection since 1990s. And I'll explain what I mean by the second half of that phrase in the next slide or two. So again, when we think about legacy issues, we're talking about issues where we've had human intervention in the past and we have to deal with those things going forward. So the obvious one is Franklin Parade was installed in 1854. And then the bikeway was in the 1990s. We have rock protection through here. We have car parks installed in the backshore and concrete blocks in the Fell Street region. So the key point here is if sea levels rise, then beaches in their natural state would normally recede. And those beaches that have room to recede, and in other words, they're kept natural in the backshores, and by backshore I simply mean the area above the beach, will tend to maintain their existing profile and sand levels. Those that cannot recede because of human interventions in the backshore will tend to lose sand levels from their beaches. Urban settlements, including protection structures placed too close to the shoreline, impose rigidity in the backshores, which are normally flexible and cope with natural cycles of accretion and erosion. And again, just to remind ourselves of the Kent Reserve example is an extreme example of long-term accretion, but the whole coast does this all the time. It actually erodes and it accretes. And when we place rigidity in the backshore, it loses the flexibility to do that, and that can cause us some problems. To look at another way here, the profile, I've got a schematic illustration here of the change of the beach and the backshore profile in this particular region. So the profile in the 1850s was a sloping beach back up to a very small road. But over time, we've actually added, we've widened the road, we've put some pine trees in, we've got a bike track. And so what's happening here, we're getting now a higher wave impact that's occurring much further out from the original shoreline. So this is an example from Yilki, which has been pushed out quite a way. And you can see this wave coming up now that in former times would have just washed up the shore. But repeatedly now, of course, we have this higher wave impact happening in this area here. So just to think about the coastal exposure in the future, I haven't got time to go through the whole of the coast, so I'm just putting some examples in to remind you, and you can go through the cell reports and you can have a look for yourself. But this is the storm surge projected for 2050 in this same region. And this would certainly overtop the defences here and would inundate the road and perhaps to a lesser extent of low height through these houses here. Certainly when we come to 2100 here for this storm surge, this is quite an impact and this would certainly overflow our defences and would inundate the road at about 0.6 of a metre. And again, we have the hazard rating. I'm not going to go through each of these. I'm thinking you probably can glance at these and get a bit of an idea. But you can see our public infrastructure is moving up to extreme, social disruption, etc. So the Coastal Adaptation Strategy here for 12.1, so this is the area we're talking about, Tabernacle Road to the Bluff boat ramp, is to install a concrete path at 3.1 metres AHD. And the AHD just simply means it's 3.1 metres above mean sea level, so above sea level, to cope with sea flood projected for 2050. So this is our incremental approach, not trying to manage the events of 2100. So we suggest the path will act as the spine of the strategy to which protection islands can be installed or upgraded as required. So taking a view of the coast near the Bluff boat ramp, this section of the coast south near the boat ramp is actually above the risk for 2050. However, this section here, if we had a flood event in 2050, would be inundated and would flood the road. And so this is a more sheltered part of the bay, but we still would find the modelling here shows that the flood would go over the top of the current bike track. So this is taking this view now from here. I'm just going to go to bird's eye view. And so the concept is to install the concrete pathway through here. And you can see here, these black numbers are the current heights. So it doesn't require too much elevation to install a path at 3.1 metres. Now this pathway will provide a spine against which to place future protection items. So for example, when it's not required now, but we could be putting some block wall here, or it may be, it could be rock revetment, or it may actually be sandbag approach. We don't really know at this stage, but the main concept in this section is simply to create the spine with a design life of about 30 to 40 years. Now this is the strategy we take from here right around the Tabernacle Road. And in fact, as we move further around the coast, which I'm not going to show you, but the coast is slightly higher, and so it's even less, there's less elevation required in the path. And in some places, we already have some protection items. We have some rock revetment and we have some concrete block. In some places around there, we have no protection. But the concept is to create the spine. And of course, we understand that this has a double purpose. First of all, we create a really nice path, which council would like and the community would like, but we also are doubling that as a protection strategy. Moving around now, as I said, I can't go through the whole coast, but this is moving around the Yilki part, where the shops are. And I've coloured this particular photo so that you can see the elevation or the height, different heights. And the terrain here is very difficult to manage because the bikeway is narrow, as you can see down here. The road is quite low, and then there's a really big Norfolk pine situated between the both of them. And so that's the first main issue here. And as I showed that that flooding photo before that video, this is an area that does get overtopped even currently. And when we think about a planning context, this particular area, this block, is actually zoned local activity centre with the possibility of buildings 3 stories high and built on boundaries. So what we're saying here is that planners should consider longer term risk of sea level rise in this location. So the option here is the same, is to consider to build, to elevate the current bike track. There's 2 ways to do this. We don't think this is the most effective. That's simply to use the existing layout, and because the bike track requires to be wider, it would mean pushing out towards the sea. And so the likely outcome here would be it would have to have rock revetment in this location. And also it's very likely, I'll just step back there, that you can see how this would actually force the coastline out. The toe of the rock would force that out, and you see this seaweed line here, so you're very likely to lose your beach. So if we have a loss of usable beach here, there's likely to be increased overtopping the further we push out, and there's an inability to create a dune system here. However, that's one option. And as I said at the start, this was a time we thought to really think about all strategies. And so we also thought that this was actually a more viable strategy over the very long term. And that's to straighten up the bike track through here at 3 metres or 4 metres wide. I forget how wide it is. And this does mean a bit more of a radical approach, removing a tree, reclaiming some of these car parks. And this way we could possibly also, because the toe of the protection would be much further in, we could probably use a much less imposing defence system using concrete blocks, which could be backfilled over with sand, and potentially possibly make a dune system here that would survive over a longer period of time. So they're the 2 options for this particular area. Now, when we move to 12.2, which is between Tabernacle Road and Kent Reserve, this area is elevated above sea flood risk. And so we recommend here we can install or upgrade protection items as required to provide protection for the sea flood event projected for 2050. And this is just a bit of a schematic outlay. There's currently old protection that's buried under here because the dune there moved out over the top. There's about 200 metres of really good condition protection here. There's a gap here of about 80 metres, and there's 200 metres which is now in poor condition. In fact, it was really the event on the 18th of July that did some damage through there, and we've got rocks, fell onto the beach. And so really our adaptation proposal here is to conduct an inspection of places we couldn't get to, and this was too late for us to look at in the project, being the 8th of July. And to design and install rock protection if required over time. So the adaptation strategy for cell 12 in Counter Bay, the key point here is the position of the shoreline of this bay was created by the swells that swing around the outcrops and wash up on the beach. The combination of increasing exposure and human intervention has brought about the need for increasing protection since the 1990s. Our adaptation approach is incremental, but at the outset we see valuable to install the spine, especially in 12.1. The assets under threat we talked about, there would be the embankment, the path, the road, and obviously there's some flooding issues later in the century to do with houses as well. Our adaptation strategy is to hold the line, install the bikeway pathway at 3.1 metres AHD, to act as the spine for the strategy until 2050, and in 12.2 install or upgrade protection items as required. And I think as an overarching principle, where possible, we really want to retain natural beaches and dunes. So this is again the adaptation tasks. We've talked about developing a monitoring program. Number 2, we can see that we could do some storm studies in this area to identify wave effect more finely, because it's likely that the wave effects that Coast Protection Board are using are set too low, and they only use one figure of a 300 millimetre wave for the whole of the coast. whereas we think we could actually do some storm surveys and then we could identify appropriately where waves are higher and lower, and then this would really help us to put in the protection items accordingly. And the item 3 or 4, just as I mentioned before, was in 12.1 to design and construct the bikeway to act as a spine for the adaptation, and 4 down the bottom, 12.2, is to review protection items and repair and upgrade as required. So that brings cell 12, Encounter Bay, to a close. If Nicole wants to say something.
Thanks, Mark. Bless you. I'd reminder again that if you have a question or a comment, please enter it into the Q&A using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We don't actually have any questions or comments as yet, Mark, so hopefully you've had enough of a breather just before we move on to our final cell, which is Victor Harbor Central.
No worries, that's cool. All right, let's move around now to Victor Harbor Central. And again, the key point here is the position of these shorelines have been formed by the swells that have penetrated either side of Brown Island. As a summary, the Esplanade Beach undergoes cycles of accretion and erosion, and there probably are some community members who remember the erosion that occurred in Esplanade Beach in this location here in 2007 to 2011, but it seems to have recovered somewhat now. And just as a general point, Flinders Parade Area Beach has been extensively modified. Again, just from another point of view, the current shape of the coastline of Victor Harbor has been dictated by the way the waves have bent and refracted around Granite Island over the last several thousand years. In fact, the existence of this sand spit, which we probably now call a headland, is related to the way that waves approach from opposite directions in this location. This also has caused this, the way the waves refract around here has also caused this bend or curve in the bay, which we'll come back to a little bit later. When we think about legacy issues or how humans have been in the past and how we've had to manage these, early photographs shows that there was a presence of well-vegetated sand dunes all along the Esplanade Beach, and these sand dunes actually went right back into Warren Reserve. By the 1930s, these sand dunes were completely removed. And in fact, you can find anecdotes in history. People were telling stories about seas coming across the top of the Esplanade Beach here and flowing right up to the Crown Hotel, obviously because there were no dunes in that location at that time. Now, fortunately, over the last few decades, there has been a dune system reinstated. And again, but another legacy issue here, we have other stormwater outlets that are set well back within the dune system here. And these were probably put in around the 1940s as well. But however, these stormwater outlets, because they are set back further than the dunes, they prevent the dune from being consolidated in these locations, and it increases the vulnerability to erosion, gulling, and the breakdown of the dune system from incursion of the sea. So again, this is one of these issues we have from stormwater outlets that, first of all, it's very difficult to maintain a consistent dune. And as the seas rise, then these will be places that will be impacted first and will tend to pull the dune system apart. Professor Hess estimated the recession of this coastline, and just to mention, the research question here is, what would the coast do in its natural state if seas rose by 1 metre as projected? We understand there's infrastructure in here now, like car parks, that this wouldn't erode through, but if this was in its natural state and the seas rose by 1 metre, then we estimate the recession could be somewhere between 35 and 69 metres. And we're just using 50 metres here to sort of hit a halfway point. Now, the good thing here is that we do have a dune system that's about 20 metres wide, but without some action or some intervention, it's likely with sea level rise, this dune system will be lost, and then we'd have the gardens and the car park being impacted directly from the sea. And again, I've just got a pictorial view here for you to have a quick look at as how we see the hazard rating emerging over the course of the century. So our strategy in brief is to consolidate and maintain the frontal dune system, is to divert stormwater and remove outlets, provide a detention system to slow the rate of stormwater out to sea and fill any low points. And currently council is using seaweed rack and sand mixture, but we can see this can be used more extensively if the dune was consolidated into one nice line. And of course, we should expect cycles of accretion and erosion, but what we hope for is that our dune system will be able to manage these over time and manage the erosion and then have time to recover into an accretion cycle. So this is moving down the Inman Street to King Street. Again, I've coloured this photograph so it has an idea of topography. The blue sections are the lowest. But the whole idea here is to consolidate this dune system. You can see there's some gaps through here where the dune system is quite narrow. So we're recommending that we actually return these to a dune system to allow the greatest flexibility possible. And then we can also divert stormwater away from the beach by pipe or by swale into the Inman River. Over time, we want to monitor dune health, height and width, and sand nourish and vegetate as required. Moving to the other end of the Esplanade Beach, the King Street to the Causeway, a very similar story here, but we want to consolidate and maintain the dunes, divert these stormwaters away from the beach, perhaps in a direction such as this. And again, our engineering company has reviewed these in preliminary form, obviously, and says, yes, these concepts are viable in these locations. So we want to fill any low points, and again, we want to monitor the dune health, height and width, and sand nourish and vegetate as required. I haven't mentioned the Inman River or the caravan park, and I just feel like time's going to get away from me. I put this in here in case someone wanted to have a question about it, but basically the caravan park is protected by a levee at 1.9 metres high. You can see it again in the colour coding here. And our recommendation is that this should be surveyed. We weren't able to do that as part of this project and assess the levee to make sure it is at a height that would accommodate sea level rise to 2050. So adaptation strategy for Victor Central Cell 11.1, and we are going to move on to 11.2 in a moment. But the key point here is the profile of this beach is in its natural state, although the width of the dunes is reduced by human intervention. So this is a good aspect of this section of coast. It is pretty much in its natural state as far as having a natural dune. The adaptation approach is incremental again. But we first want to consolidate and maintain the dune system and monitor over time. The assets under threat at the moment are minor pedestrian access points predominantly. But of course, if we don't manage the dune and it does recede, then eventually the car park and the gardens will become under threat. But unlikely the road, which is a great thing that they, in times past, the planners put the road quite a way back from the shore. So our adaptation strategy, the short to mid-term strategy is to remove the gaps along this beach and create a consolidated and well-vegetated dune system. The longer-term strategy is to maintain the dune system for as long as feasible and facilitate recession of the dune if this occurs with sand nourishment and vegetation. Of course, if the coast continues to recede, hopefully we can see this particular strategy work for 20 to 30 years or more. There's no reason why it couldn't work longer. Then harder protections may become necessary if we get back to the car park. Again, this again comes back to our projections of sea level rise. We don't really know how fast or slow these will rise. So we can now move around to 11.2, which is the Flinders Parade Bridge Terrace area. And we'll have a look at that one now. So again, when we look at legacy issues in this area, human intervention has been quite significant. I've got a series of photographs here. The photograph on the top left was actually taken in 1910, despite the heading there that came from a newspaper article. But just to be reminded that the coast in its natural state here was just a small dune, which is just above the high water mark. Now, in 1920, when they were considering the Soldiers Memorial Gardens, Charles Reed, who was the planner for the gardens, in fact, he was the same person who planned Colonel Light Gardens, gave a public lecture in Victor Harbour and told everybody unless they put in the seawall, then the gardens weren't viable because seawater was already coming through into this area. So we only say that to note that this was a vulnerable area 100 years ago. So it's obviously a lot more vulnerable now with a bit of sea level rise. And just keeping a note on that tree there, you can see over time this seawall failed in the 70s and 80s and had to be rebuilt. And this is the tree here. So since the 1980s, this has been pushed out further. And this again is a bit like the Yilkey area, just trying to make the point that when you push out into the sea, then you have higher impact and then you have the potential to lose the beach, which seems to be perhaps occurring in this location along here. And actually this was taken after a storm, as I mentioned about accommodation. There comes a point where you say, well, we can accommodate some overtopping and we can clean up after. We don't necessarily have to manage every single aspect of actions of the sea. So we could take an accommodation strategy in this location for some time to come, if necessary. And then this last one just demonstrates that along this piece of coast, it has been has some significant human intervention. When we look at it from a different angle, the human intervention also extends to the installation of playing fields and reserves, which is really be constructed within the swale, what I call a swale. So you have that fore dune we mentioned before, now raised, and then you have Flinders Parade, which was probably the old shoreline about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago when seas were a bit higher. So what we've tended to do as humans, we've put all this infrastructure in the middle there, in a swale area between the old and new shoreline. And again, when we look at the inundation outlook, this is just a snapshot. So this is the 1 in 100 year event for a current would certainly overtop and flood into this area if that occurred. This is the 1 in 100 year event for 2050. And then you can see that the 1 in 100 year event for 2100 would certainly inundate the gardens and playing fields by up to 1 to 1.5 metres in depth, so quite significant. The other interesting point here is that we've also modelled routine high water events, as I mentioned before. And so what, by 2100, this event here that we're looking at becomes the routine high water event. So this would be occurring in 2100 every month or two. So you can see that the impact would be quite significant unless we were to raise the defences a long way. And I also mentioned, I've just got a little squiggle that's come up down the bottom right-hand side of the screen, just to remind ourselves that with increased depth of water, we're going to have increased height of waves and energy of waves, and that curve there in the coast that has been formed over time by these actions of the waves, the impact would become more severe in this area here, as the coast in its natural state would want to receive there most. The erosion outlook, I just remind you again, is given as though there's been no human intervention in the back shore. I simply asked the question, if this was a natural shoreline, what would the coast want to do with 1 metre sea level rise? And we would say that it wants to recede back to approximately Flinders Parade. And again, we have an outlook, which really is an inundation and erosion outlook in this particular case, showing that we're predicting some extreme hazard ratings for later in the century. So when we look at now, the first part is what I call the headland part. So the adaptation strategy here, we see there'll be a long-term commitment to protect the headland because we have the gardens there and we also have the access to Granite Island. In the meantime, as I mentioned before, we could accommodate some overtopping over a period of time. In the longer term, probably the defence would need to be raised along here to protect this particular section of coast. Now, when we move further to the north, we're actually thinking here that we're thinking of a transformative approach. If you think back to the introduction, so rather than take an incremental approach, this transformational approach would analyse how the coast in its natural state would respond to sea level rise. And then the key point is to develop a new master plan that would manage these rises as much as possible. The overarching principle here is that currently the line of defence for this section of coast is the elevated embankment, or I called it before the incipient dune. You remember the black and white photograph? That's where our current line of defence is. That has been formed just above the high water mark. So the overarching adaptation principle is to translate a raised line of defence adjacent to Flinders Parade and Bridge Terrace, and design a more natural beach and a back shore that is more suitable to manage the various actions of the sea in the context of projected sea level rise. So we recognise, of course, if we're taking a transformative approach, this is quite a bold approach. But as we said, we think this is the time to discuss all options, and we're certainly putting this out in the context that council and the community could consider developing a master plan for this area to manage sea level rise. Let's have a look at it in a bit more detail. And again, we're talking about legacy issues. I have this colour code here, and you can see these green areas here are below the sea level, the storm surge at 2050. So these would be inundated, and they've been constructed within the swale. The bridge terrace here is quite low as well, and stormwater is quite a problem because it drains from the coast into a very low section of the coast, and these stormwater outlets are set very, very low. So in our thinking, we've got two options here. One is we can remain with the current layout, but this is going to require significant protection. So we would imagine to manage overtopping, we would probably need to raise these defences or this embankment along the front here by at least 1.5 metres to manage sea level rise. Or we could consider alternative layouts, and that's what we've done in this project. So how would this work? So currently the coastal ridge line is on the old foredune. I'm just calling it a ridge line, and we talked about that before. It's now an embankment, or it's a protected item as we get closer or further to the south. So we're suggesting we consider creating a ridge line at the adjacent to the road at 3.3 metres AHD. And this could be, for example, in the form of a promenade about 8 metres wide. We could then return this section of the coast to a more natural state. So it will be flexible for a road and a creek. And then we could likely to maintain a brief beach through here as well. To make this adaptation strategy a bit clearer, we'll look at this in profile view as well. So I just want to make the point here that these drawings are to illustrate concepts, and they're not intended to be prescriptive about how space are utilised. We're hoping that this project will be a way to start the conversation, and we think this is the profiles also help us to analyse what we're talking about. So, for example, if we take a profile through the Bowling Green Air Terrace, the current back shore here is always under pressure, and to cope with sea level rise, we would need to raise this another 1.5 metres. That's what we're saying. So it's about the height of those people, because this is to scale somewhat. So the other thing will happen if we do that, if we have to keep raising these front defences, we're going to increasingly cut off the community to the coast, and we're going to lose this beach here because it's just going to become a huge amount of rock, which will protect from seawater coming over, but also prohibits or inhibits people being able to enjoy the coast. So as an alternative layout, we're suggesting that we would bring the protection structures further back to Flinders Parade, and then you could form a natural beach through here, which could accrete and could be sand nourished, could accrete and recede, erode in accordance with whatever's happening in the ocean climate at the time. Looking at a second example, this is the volleyball court in Bridge Terrace, and here we have quite a low road. And again, you can see here in comparison, this is the height of the embankment currently, and we would need to raise that again so that the seas didn't come over the top. In fact, actually, maybe I've already raised that to 3.4 to manage that in my diagram. But again, you can see how this is going to tend to cut off the community from the beach, and this would probably need to be rock protected as well. So our concept here is to move the line of defence back towards the road, raise the road here, And then we can also manage stormwater perhaps in this environment here. With a raised road, it'll be much easier. Then we can decide how these spaces are used over time. That's not really the issue here. When we're talking about sand supply, we know that sand supply has been dropping in this particular area. So we're saying if this was to be a sandy beach, how could we manage it? Well, the team generally agreed, and I'm talking about the engineers and the coastal geomorphologists, agreed that putting in a groin here, and this is schematic only, it's just to make a point that we could manage the sand in this area between the existing boat ramp, or the old boat ramp, and a potential groin in somewhere in this location here. However, we caveat this with saying that more research would be required to analyse the sand movement area, which is not really well known, just to make sure that this would actually work. And again, the other ideal point about this is we could actually take stormwater off the beach where it's actually coming out of these beaches, and we could manage it through this groin. And we're aware, of course, there are some discussions about other structures that might be proposed for this area, but this was not part of our review. We were simply asking the question, how will we manage the sand on this beach if it was put to us to do so? And this is again from a bird's eye view, a bit of a summary, where we have this groin here, more of a sandy beach, and the line of the fence would be back further towards Flinders Parade, and yet maintain your rock protection through here, so this headland is protected. So I guess in summary, we would say our proposal was to consider the development of a master plan that establishes a layout that manages sea level rise projected for 2,100, that creates usable and pleasant public spaces and deals with the stormwater problems that we have. And again, this is caveat on the need for research on sand movement and coastal processes. This is just a pictorial example of a place in New South Wales that had a similar problem actually, where they had protection items quite far forward from memory, and they were continually battered. So they took a completely different approach. And there's a number of these examples around. And again, this is not to be prescriptive and say this is what Victor Harbour would look like. It's just to set our imagination going a little bit to show how other people are managing to absorb the impacts of the sea and yet maintain open spaces and a beach as well. And I've got another layout concept down the bottom there, which again is just for us to think about and to perhaps get the discussion going. So in summary, our adaptation strategy for 11.2, the key point here, I think it's difficult to imagine or envisage how Flinders Parade and Bridge Terrace precinct could be managed if seas rose as projected by 2,100. And on that basis, rather than just say, well, let's keep just adding protection items to the front, and that may be what council and community decide, but we think it's worthwhile considering a transformative approach, and that would consider realigning the shoreline adjacent to Flinders Parade and Bridge Terrace. The assets under threat are obvious. We've seen them in the photos. So the adaptation strategies, the overarching adaptation principle is to translate a raised line of defence adjacent to Flinders Parade and Bridge Terrace and design a more natural beach and a back shore that's able to accommodate various actions of the sea, as well as be able to manage the sea level rise trend to 2,100. However, just to be really clear, the immediate proposal is to consider the development of a master plan. So we see this as the main next step, not to necessarily consider everything as we've presented is the final design, but simply as a way to consider an alternative future if the council and community wish to consider that. We do believe that an outcome of such an approach is likely to be a more natural form in the bay that can be enjoyed by people for decades to come, and with a long-term legacy of a sandy natural beach. That's my idealistic look at the whole project. Again, these adaptation tasks, we've talked about 1 and 2, and we've really talked about 3, which is the Esplanade Beach to consolidate and build a dune system. And then we can also consider creating a master plan for Flinders Parade and the Bridge Terrace precinct. And this is just a summary of the whole coast. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but just we can see when we're looking through ourselves here, 10 to 12, we've mostly taken an incremental approach. One location we're suggesting should be transformative. We've got an environmental response in 2 locations where we're looking to create more natural dunes. And then in these other locations, we're going to need some engineering responses to construct protection items. Generally, because we have an established coastal urban environment, it is going to be a hold the line strategy with potentially maybe a managed retreat for Flinders Parade back to the Flinders Parade itself. And that's just the 2050 strategy, and we don't know exactly what that strategy will be in the future, but probably similar. So the key points as I'm closing, Nicole can take over again, is the Coastal Adaptation Study has provided a baseline understanding of how the coast has performed over time and a context from which to envisage plausible futures if seas rise as projected. The second key point is that ongoing monitoring will continue to build the baseline understanding. It will help us track progress in the context of sea level rise and will form the basis for ongoing decision making. Our approach to coastal adaptation should be no regrets. There are likely to be regrets if we do nothing, and there are likely regrets if we do too much, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation. As much as possible, we should design our coastal regions in the context of coastal geomorphology. And by that I mean, we've got to try and work with coastal risks and trends, coastal impacts, rather than fighting against them as much as possible. And in some locations, the strategies presented here tonight are just a starting point, and there will be need for more research, consultation, design, costing, and implementation plans. So I can take, we could consider some questions or discussion, and I've just managed to squeeze in my favourite photo of the whole history of photos, which is Victor Harbour in 1910. Over to you, Nicole.
Lovely, thanks very much, Mark. So I might just send out one last encouraging call to people who are online. If you have any questions, comments or feedback that we can respond to while you're here, we'd love to hear from you, but at the moment we don't have anyone doing that. So just while I'm closing off, and I'll come back to the Q&A in a minute if anyone does have any last minute questions or comments, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us today. In terms of the next steps, the Coastal Adaptation Strategy adaptation options are currently on consultation. I encourage you and others to go online and complete an online feedback form, which can be found on Council's website on the Your Say page. Feedback does close on the 1st of October. There are a series of informational fact sheets that support the strategy in terms of, I guess, summarising it and explaining what it is proposing. The recording of today's webinar will be posted again on Council's website tomorrow, so that will be available for viewing. So if there are people that you are speaking with in your networks that are interested, please encourage them to go there to view the presentation. Other than that, after the close of the consultation, the last thing to say is that, of course, all the feedback will be collated. It'll be considered in finalising the strategy, and ultimately that strategy will go to Council for final approval before being released. So I'd like to say thank you very much to you, Mark, for that. You're always, I find, a very informative presenter of the work, and it's always incredibly interesting. And I always love the photos you dig out of, I don't know where, but archives somewhere, I think, which reminds us of, you know, the beautiful part of the coastline that Victor Harbour Council shares. I'd also like to thank Lee Jeffrey and Kathy Hayter, who are here from Council, and the other Council staff who are viewing this online, and also the people who have joined us here live today. So, Mark, there aren't any last minute questions or comments, so I'll take that as for now that people are digesting, and we'll hopefully view the content online. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye.